And I think asking scientists to make the final decision alone, it asks them to make a value judgment. That is a really tricky position to put them in, right? And I know that sortition is only one example of a way to create an explicit division of labor. But to me, that is almost exactly the purpose, is to get a bunch of people together whose interests are truly affected in different ways and have them learn from external information and then exclusively make value judgments.
Welcome to Web3 with A16Z. I'm Robert Hackett, and today we're dusting off an ancient practice that has become trendy once again, the old but new idea of sortition, or selecting representatives by lottery. Sortition was used in ancient Athenian democracy to elect public officials. It's also been lately revived by tech companies like Meta and AI startups like OpenAI and Anthropic to tackle some of their thorniest policymaking challenges. Our guests today are experts on sortition, including Bailey Flanigan, a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard who is joining MIT as an assistant professor next year, and who has helped develop selection algorithms for sortition that are in use today. Also joining is Andy Hall, Stanford University poli-sci professor, advisor to Meta, and consultant to A16Z crypto research. In this episode, we discuss why not to rely exclusively on expert authority, how the process of deliberation changes people's minds, and how sortition can apply everywhere from the governance of countries to the governance of crypto projects, and more. As a reminder, none of the following should be taken as tax, business, legal, or investment advice. Please see a16z.com/disclosures for more important information, including a link to a list of our investments. So, okay, I want to start off and ask you, Bailey, what is sortition?
Yeah, so sortition as a concept came about in ancient Athens as a way of selecting everyday people to participate in government. And there was this randomized process that was kind of like a uniform lottery, although I think historically it was a little bit more complicated. But in principle, you can think of it as just a uniform lottery over the population, and you select some people via this method, and they come together as like citizen representatives of everyday people, and they suggest policy, maybe they deliberate, weigh in on existing policies. It depends on the application.
Of all of the governance methods that are out there, why would you want a bunch of randos to be deciding things for you?
Literal randos.
Yeah,
Yeah, like
literally
actual
randos. From a
randos.
technical perspective, they're randos. I personally like it because I think that it lends legitimacy to government. When you can say that, these are everyday people who have no political motives or incentives, they're not trying to get reelected or anything, and they don't even really have any political training or priors. And they come into the situation and they learn from ideally a balanced set of experts and information. I think people are really capable of making really good, reasonable suggestions under really good conditions in a way that I think it's pretty hard for politicians to do in some cases because they're motivated by so many things other than just what people want.
Mhm.
I also think maybe the public, in the end, if it's well executed, may trust the outcome more because it's just a transparent or like more transparent process.
I'd add a few things to that. One is that if you don't randomly select people and you allow there to be this process by which some people choose to engage in government and others don't, you could have a problem where the people who stand up and want to be involved are precisely the people you don't want involved. So, like, a very great saying about this comes from Douglas Adams, in one of his other books, not The Hitchhiker's Guide. I'm going to paraphrase it, but he basically says, the people who want to rule you are ipso facto unqualified to rule you. By the very fact that they want to be in charge, they shouldn't be in charge.
This also goes back to ancient Greece. I forget one of the philosophers, I think Socrates maybe, like he knows he's not wise and that makes him wise, whatever. It's like a paradoxical kind of thing.
Socrates, I think, a big part of his view is that you needed experts to rule. And he draws these extended analogies to, like, you wouldn't ask a random person to be a carpenter or to navigate a ship. He has a very famous analogy to the captain of a ship. But others thought this could be a good part of the system for these reasons that you don't want to allow only the people who want to do it to manipulate everyone else. And I'll just add, it doesn't need to be end all be all. Like you can use it for some things and not others. And I think most times and places where it's been proposed, including in ancient Greece, the idea was not like all decisions all the time would be made through this mechanism. It was a way to select certain offices for certain decisions, particularly the ones where you don't think it requires the specialized expertise of full-time government officials.
Yeah, and just, I mean, add to that too. There's just a lot of people in the standard representative electoral government. Representative, I'll put that in quotes because there's just a lot of people who will never have access to the credentials or the money required to gain influence. And that to me is a pretty significant problem. And this is one way to at least allow a much less filtered group of people to weigh in on policy.
There are different kinds of, you know, organizations you could be running or decisions you could be making. I imagine back in ancient Greece, like you wouldn't want random people designing and constructing like trireme warships. Like that probably was a specialized task that you needed somebody to know how to like, you know, build a hull or whatever. What are the kinds of things that this is good for?
Here's like, I guess, the framework I've been thinking about. Now, I want to say outright, I'm not sure it's good for anything. Like, we don't
Okay,
know.
that's
Like,
fighting words.
but other options don't seem all that good either. So I
Mm.
think we don't really know is the first part of the answer. They're really not used a lot. There's no precedent for using them for like a high stakes decision that society is very concerned about, where if you decided one way or the other, major things would change. You can't really point to any example yet where that's happened. And personally, I doubt we'll ever get there. But here's
Although
like,
on a personal level, like probably place where people would experience this most is in jury duty. Is that right?
yeah, that's fair. You could
Which is
think of that.
consequential for people's lives, but
Absolutely. Absolutely. If
maybe
you want
not
to count
like,
that.
you know, governing national policy.
Yes. Yeah. I think you could think of jury duty as fitting into this model. They're making a one off decision on a single piece of adjudication versus setting a policy that's going to affect the whole country. There's a wide gap there. So, in terms of applications, I mean, what people usually point to, I think the most natural space is sort of like value laden judgments that are more about resolving fundamentally irreconcilable trade offs that we can only appeal to values to decide on, like where we should set the line on abortion policy or something. Science is not going to tell us what to do there. It's a values decision. You don't need a lot of expertise to decide that. You need deep understanding of what society feels about this issue. That's the first element, I think. And if you look, everything I just said is often used to justify referendums or
Mm.
ballot initiatives, some kind
Mhm.
of pressure valve outlet where you go around elected officials and let the voters speak directly. We have a lot of reasons to think those don't always work very well. A big reason why we think they don't work very well is because of low rates of participation and low rates of attention. Sortition is then a tool where you undo the low participation. You're worried not very many people are going to vote on this referendum, and the people who do are going to have very weird, unusual views. What
Because these
if
are the people who are motivated to
yeah.
actually.
And then a very logical thing you might say is instead of a referendum, let's randomly sample a group of voters we know is representative, get them all to think about this thing, and then make a decision together. And that might be better than a referendum. And in particular, one part we haven't talked about yet is it might be especially good if you think that at baseline, people don't have well-formed preferences or views on this issue. And so when you just have a vote on it, they don't vote in ways that are actually consistent with their underlying values. They have to sit in a room and talk about it and learn before they can actually figure out what they think. And that's like you have to deliberate before you can form views. And so you can see of it as a mechanism to just replace referendums.
Did the founders, like the American founders, the founding fathers, did they have different ideas about representative democracy and the way to achieve it? Did they consider sortition or government by lottery at all for any purposes? Or was that just too mad?
My impression is that sentiments were more toward we need experts to govern.
Yeah. People really through, the classical era up to the founding of America, people looked back on Athenian democracy not as this unalloyed success that everyone should model, The whole view was this thing was a shit show. There's a really cool idea underlying it that we want to bring back, and it enshrines some values that we like, but it did not work at all. And it led Athens to make truly catastrophic decisions, particularly this decision to invade Sicily. And they looked instead much more to Rome, which had built this more hybrid system that had a lot of mechanisms we would recognize today as suppressing the views of many people and being undemocratic, but that also tried to make the system function much more effectively. And it did for a much longer period of time.
Rome
I
had
would
its own set of issues, though.
out of more than a few.
Yeah.
But when you look back at that history and you look at the founding, like the debates over how to design it, it was much more like, we are not building some wackadoodle utopian society where everyone decides on everything. We're like building a system that's going to work. And it was not motivated by things like sortition. They would have been a small, small part of the discussion.
So why use sortition today? Why are we dusting off this old concept and trying to use it?
I'll use that question as an opportunity to kind of go back to what kinds of questions is sortition good for. And the example you gave about building a warship, that's like an example of something where you pretty much need to be guided exclusively by the scientific method. And then there's questions that are like purely value judgments. Like you've got two people's welfare, and you just have to choose how to trade them off. You can't satisfy everyone. And so you need to make a really difficult trade off. But there's also like a lot of issues that kind of fall in the middle of those. Like they have both components regulating AI. Algorithms have technical underpinnings, but they also have human implications and trade offs. How do you tease those apart to allow a group of everyday people who maybe doesn't understand a lot of the technical aspects to still weigh in on the value judgments and then use those value judgments to inform the technical components, and maybe vice versa as well? I think there's a huge design space actually here in designing the deliberative process to allow the outsourcing of the scientific method, but still distill those value questions. I'm actually working on a project on this right now, and it's super difficult. And I think a lot of people have tried to do it, but they haven't necessarily thought about the formal process of distilling these two components and truly separating them. Because you don't want people to be implicitly guessing at the scientific method. And you also have to deal with the fact that the scientific method leaves uncertainty. And so then you have to ask the value question of, as this assembly, who do you want to bear the risk of the uncertainty that the scientific method has left? So you've got risks, you've got values, and you've got science. And these are things that are like very different, and you have to think about them in really different ways. So anyway, this is something I'm thinking a lot about actually. And I think hopefully one thing that will come out of it is an understanding of which issues should this be applied to and how do you apply it?
You said you're working on a project right now related to
Well,
this?
in its infancy, I mean, I think one application called environmental justice metrics, it's basically how you measure environmental risk of different communities based on like a lot of factors.
Huh.
And people tend to kind of aggregate these factors into scores, but they do so in a way that I think hasn't really been weighed in on by people. It's usually kind of like a combination of maybe causal inference, but there are opportunities here for the scientific method. There's certainly uncertainty. And there's also value judgments about which factors are most important. So that's one example maybe of the kind of like first application that would be interesting.
So, I mean, for this example where you're talking about trade-offs and getting people's opinions and stuff, is it like maybe some people care less that they have a chemical plant in their backyard or something? Like, is that the kind of input that you'd be getting out of this?
It could be. I mean, I think you're alluding to something like lived experience, which is when you are the person who will bear the cost or bear the benefit of like whatever decision gets made here. What does your lived experience say about what you think is best for you? That would be an example. Yeah, please
I
add.
just 100% agree with this, and I think it's something society is doing a very bad job on right now. There's a huge separation between what we can use science to decide and what we need to decide via these value trade-offs. And just to jump to the most controversial possible topic, because that's what I like to
Great.
do.
That's what we want.
Like COVID policy had this problem
Yeah.
where there's this attitude like, we're just going to do whatever the science tells us to do.
Science is doing a
is
lot of work in that sentence.
utterly idiotic way to choose policy. Like the policies certainly need to be informed by science. We need to know, for example, what are going to be the implications for societal health if we close schools versus we open them? That's an essential input to the decision. But once we have the inputs from science, the actual policy decision is a value trade-off informed by science about how much we want to prioritize the health of different groups, the education of our children, etc. The idea that that's a decision that can be made by science is an extraordinarily misguided and stupid belief that a large number of American elites hold today that is completely crazy. And I think sortition is just a helpful example to show you why the two things need to be separated and why having a group of people not weigh in on the science, but informed by the science weigh in on these difficult value trade-offs is precisely the right kind of division of labor we would like to set up.
So instead of taking it on fiat from some elites that are saying like, okay, your schools have to be shut down, instead maybe like polling the people who would be affected by this, the kids, the parents, the administrators, ask them what they want to do. Maybe they want to keep the school open. Maybe there are good reasons for that.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think asking scientists to make the final decision alone, it asks them to make a value judgment.
Exactly.
And that is a really tricky position to put them in, right? Because
Totally.
it's the expectation, and people, I think they don't quite realize that there is really these two different steps, as you very
100%.
clearly laid out. And I know that sortition is only one example of a way to tease those apart and really create an explicit division of labor. But to me, that is almost exactly the purpose of sortition, is to get a bunch of people together whose interests are truly affected in different ways by the decision, and have them learn from external information to the greatest degree it exists, and then exclusively make value judgments.
So how do you make sure that you get a representative group of people?
Okay, well, it's really, really, really hard. In the practice of sortition, as it exists today, the participation rate that I often hear quoted is about 2 to 5% of people will respond to an invitation to participate in like a citizens' assembly.
That's quite low. Is the outreach usually by email or something?
It depends. Sometimes it's by phone, sometimes it's by letter, usually like a uniformly random sample of the population that
I
you
mean,
get from.
speaking personally, like I basically don't click links in emails. And if I
For
don't know the
sure.
phone number that's calling me, I'm not answering it. So
Yeah,
I
I
can
mean,
imagine why the rates are so low.
right. And I mean, it's possible that that will be somewhat addressed as citizens' assemblies if they get more institutionalized or publicly known. Maybe that will get better because you won't be like, what is this? Why am I getting this random email? Throw it away.
Hmm.
But the other problem is that the people who do say yes kind of seem to be very self-selected, I would call it, which is very, very skewed on many demographic and belief-related attributes.
This seems very related to the like weird issue in social sciences, the Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. So like all these social psychology studies feature a particular sampling of the population that's like college educated students who are willing to get paid some money to participate in a study. And so it just skews the research that it comes out of it.
Yeah, and so there's been a lot of work done recently, and I think there's a lot more to do to try to say, okay, if you're given a pretty self-selected group, what is the best way you can randomly choose the final assembly in a way that kind of restores some representation on observable characteristics. But the unobservable characteristics are just such an enormous problem, and you can't really do much about that until we understand what the filtration looks like from the population to those who actually agree to participate in the first place. So, yeah, it's a pretty thorny problem.
Well, I hadn't thought about this before, but I guess his putting together Robert's point from before with yours, like one solution, which would not work when it's a one-off project by an organization. Jury duty is mandatory, and people do respond to those invitations, and the participation rate.
I've somehow
Not
dodged it to date. I've never
My
had to sit on a
dream is to
jury.
serve on a jury, and I never get on. And
I would like
It's
to.
maddening.
I'd like to
do
I'm
my
like
civic
desperate
duty.
to serve on
I
one.
always get kicked off.
I've never even gotten in the room. I've never even gotten in the room to get kicked off. I get the letter, I check online, and then I'm always told, like, you don't even have to come in. We don't need
Same
you.
here.
It's so frustrating.
Same here.
Oh,
But anyways, if you really enshrine the system within a broader governmental system, then you could get people to do it because you could require that they do it.
I do think that it's true that it would probably be a lot better, but I do think there's still like self-selection in who goes to jury duty, right? Because there's a lot of exemption criteria that you can meet. And I was just actually reading about this because I was trying to understand whether mandatory jury duty is a good case study for kind of what would happen to self-selection bias if you mandated participation in sortition. And there are still issues related to certain groups basically not appearing on juries like pretty much ever or at just extremely low rates, and that there's actually concern that that affects the quality of the decisions, particularly about certain groups. So it's not a perfect system. I still think you need to think about how do you really ensure representation when you select the final assembly, even if it were mandatory. But I do think it would go a long way.
Yeah. There are countries, that have compulsory voting, which is not something based on my philosophical principles, I am uncomfortable with, but it works surprisingly
You're
well. Like
conscientious objector to voting.
as you know, Robert.
Yeah.
We talked about that at dinner last night. But it works remarkably. I say this grudgingly as someone who doesn't like the idea of the government forcing me to do something that I might not want to do. But when you look
If you
at
voted,
it,
you could, elect somebody who's going to not force you to maybe do that.
to undo
You got to have your
compulsory voting.
voice
But if
represented.
you look, there's really great research on Australia and Brazil, and there are a few other countries that have these laws, and people in the countries tend to like it. Compliance rates are quite high. If you really want to get out of it, you can, but the vast, vast, vast majority of people do vote.
Countries that enforce mandatory voting.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Yeah.
So it actually goes over pretty well, but you just are not a fan.
There's something about America and the American government telling me I have to vote that would bother me.
Yeah.
Bother me quite deeply.
Yep.
Yeah.
Do you think that people who are required to vote really think about the decision?
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, if I'm like forced to vote on every issue that comes up, I mean, am I really going to do the research on every issue and think
I
about
see.
what I really
I see.
believe? Like, I worry that people will just respond. Maybe the turnout is really good, but like, maybe they
Yeah.
aren't thinking about the decision that much. I don't know. What do you think?
I had a friend who, during standardized tests in high school, would just do Guitar Hero in the multiple choice. Like, he'd like fill out A, C, like for one column, and then like whatever song he was playing at that time. So yeah, I think you could get some uninformed voting if you tried to do that.
Yeah, I'm wondering how widespread you think that is.
It's definitely a concern. A few things I would say. One, the compulsory voting, typically the way it's implemented, it's only for these, high salience national elections that don't occur very frequently. So they're not being asked to shoulder that much of a burden. It's in the context of vigorous campaigning. And while you are required to vote, again, you can opt out. In Australia, you can pay a relatively small fine. Most people choose not to. I think the turnout rate's around 97% or something. You're completely welcome to just cast a blank ballot. And so if you really feel like you don't know, you don't have to put something that you
Got
don't.
it.
And so I think that actually helps because there aren't that many people who are going to like straight up troll. If they're really uncomfortable and they feel like they don't know very much, they can leave it blank. The reality is, in the context of a vigorous national campaign, it's not that hard to like figure out which party you think you should vote for. And so most people do vote. Australia also has ranked choice voting, but that's a whole other rabbit hole we probably shouldn't go down.
Next podcast.
Yeah.
Random tangential question. We refer to secret ballots as Australian voting. Isn't that like a thing?
Yeah.
Do you know the history there?
There are people who know better than me, but basically there was this key time in the late 19th century where a bunch of democratic countries, Australia, the UK, the US, became quite concerned. Today we would call this clientelism. And you recognize it today in many democratic countries still, where voting is organized around networks of patronage. And there was the sense that it was verifiable who you voted for. And that then facilitated systematic vote buying, where a party could observe you voting for them and then reward you for doing so. In small ways, by like buying you a beer at the polling place, or in big ways by giving you jobs when they were in office. Not everyone considers this a bad thing. And today, not everyone considers it a bad thing. Like there are contexts in which that might be the way you think politics should be organized. But these sort of different use of the word progressive than we would use it today, these like progressive ideals were growing that sort of like we need a more scientific and business-like approach to politics. It was the era where we were building these stories about everyone gets informed and then we make the best decision. And it's not about things like getting jobs in the administration and stuff like that. And the Australian ballot was implemented in Australia. As I recall, I think the main motivation was to short circuit this process of vote buying, and the US implemented it. And there's some evidence that it reduced the power of these local parties because they weren't able to reward people for voting for them anymore.
I would guess, too, that it would lower participation rates, but that's just a...
Yes, that's a major claim that's made. Yeah. Participation rates in the US, first of all, are generally higher than people say. I always start by saying that because it really bothers me. Like, I tell them participation in Dallas is low, and they're like, well, it's low in the US too. And I'm like, it's actually pretty high in the US. It's like 70%.
Is it that high?
It's high.
That's actually surprising.
Yeah, I find it maddening when people claim it's low. I understand why they say it, and you can certainly point to elections where it's lower than 70%, but our presidential turnout rates are pretty darn high. In the 19th century, they were super high. And a retrospective claim on that is that it was an era in which highly organized, very professionalized partisan organizations were systematically getting people to vote in ways that we don't see today. There's a lot of other factors, so we're not like confident that's the explanation, but it seems like it's definitely part of it.
Okay, that was a tangent.
Something we didn't talk about, which I know Bailey has thought a lot about and been involved in, is sort of like using this in tech.
Hmm.
And I think the appeal to using it there is that we don't have access to these other mechanisms. I was involved in an effort to design one for Meta, which is now being used for AI-related issues. And the motivation we had was, this is a very value-laden decision. The first one that Meta ran was on how should you define climate misinformation. As I said, I always like to go straight to the most controversial possible topics.
Yeah.
And the view was, this is a great one because it's super important, it's super value-laden, it's super controversial. And then unlike for government, a tech company just doesn't seem like the right entity to make a decision on something like that. And so you have this real need to go out and perhaps get your users, the people living in your online community, to tell you what they think the rule should be. And then if you accept that premise that that's how we should do this and that's better than having a CEO decide this, then you have to start asking these practical questions about like, well, how would you get the users to decide? And you could ask the users to vote. That's like the first idea people had. Like Mark Zuckerberg ran a referendum on Facebook in the late aughts, 2008 or so, and it just didn't work because you couldn't get enough people to vote. And so now thinking about this, circa 2020, we were like, okay, you want to give this decision out to the people, the users, you can't ask them to vote. The logical conclusion is you should use sortition. And so I think it's a cool area for this because with a government, you can construct arguments for why your elected officials and ballot initiatives and referendums and jury duty are already kind of occupying this space. I'm a little bit more of a skeptic on like where the room is for sortition there. Maybe there is some. But for a tech company making a decision, it seems like it's the obvious right way to do it because they don't have access to these other options.
Another question in the tech company sphere that I think would be super interesting from a research perspective, I'm from computer science. A lot of people there think a lot about recommendation algorithms and what they're doing and what are their impacts. And I tried to work on this once. And where I got stuck was the question of what constitutes harm. That's a very subjective question, right? Because, some people would say that facilitating a riot, if it aligns with their political beliefs, for example, is not harm. But other people would say that that is. And so if you want to measure and study recommendation algorithms, you kind of need a determined notion of what constitutes a harm and a benefit. And that would be another example of something that I actually think people should weigh in on, because a lot of the harms and benefits that people think about are inherently political and very personal and reflect trade-offs in people's well-being.
Meta thought a lot about this with respect to the oversight board, which is you need the science, in this case, to tell you if you rank content this way versus that way, what actually happens. Because it turns out our intuitions about that are completely wrong. It was just like the age-old thing, like everyone thinks that ranking content chronologically is the solution to all their problems. And then anytime you actually give people chronologically ranked feeds, they hate them.
Yeah.
And so it's like our intuitions about what to do with ranking are completely useless. You have to study it. And then given those facts, you're then making highly value-laden decisions. And I really like the example you use on riots because it's a perfect one where people form these views that there's just a uniform principle you can apply. And it just doesn't work because, and this happened after 2016, it became accepted by a large body of elites in America that the thing you needed to do was like anytime quote unquote violence was called for on social media, you must remove it.
Exactly.
And the problem is there's lots of contexts in the world where the government is horrible. And it's not good to say, I'm sorry, you're not allowed to talk about your government being terrible. You're not allowed to coordinate to meet somewhere to protest your government. That's dangerous. That's obviously not what people in America had in mind when they were saying we should remove this kind of content. But it was a huge, unforeseen, though obvious to some of us, problem that came out of that. And so it's again, there are no easy answers. There are really hard trade-offs to make. How much do you want to prioritize protecting the status quo versus encouraging disruption, which might be dangerous? That's an unbelievably difficult trade-off and not an obvious one to resolve.
Yeah, this is exactly the conversation that we had where we got stuck. And kind
Yeah.
of there are good riots and there are
Yes.
bad riots. And
Yes. Good
there's
luck
everybody
figuring
who
out
is
which
in
is
the
which.
riot thinks their riot was a good
Any
riot.
riot
So
I'm in is perfectly moral and
right,
justified.
precisely. There's other harms too. I mean, there's of course the whole free speech, violent speech thing that's going on. And I think there's real arguments on both sides.
I am always surprised when you look at these kinds of questions about speech and content and all that, and you just look at the survey attitudes of Americans. It is remarkable how wise and reasonable and moderate their views are relative to the right-wing and left-wing elite conversation about these issues.
Yeah.
And I think had the average American had more say in the 2016 to 2024 period over the conversation about social media content moderation, we would be in a far better place than we are. That's my
Totally
very
agreed.
biased opinion.
My survey of my Uber drivers reflects that the average person is extremely reasonable. Like that's like my
Oh, is this a formal survey or an informal
absolutely
survey?
not.
Okay.
It is unrepresentative.
Okay.
The other thing that I'm kind of interested in potentially using assemblies for is government accountability. And I'm not exactly sure what the right application of this would be, but I think there's a lot of cases where there's institutions in the government that you kind of want to audit. What are you doing? How are you doing it? Like, is this really in line with the values that we think our government should have? And I don't think that there's a lot of accountability in some of those cases. And so I think it would be cool to see assemblies there, maybe ranging from like involved with the FDA to like actually involved with governmental committees. Just because I think there's a lot of distrust of these institutions among people. And part of the reason is because you can't really see what's going on inside.
I love that idea.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
we do it?
Randomized audits.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly.
Huh.
Because I think people are pretty good at looking at something and being kind of like, it doesn't pass the sniff test. Like,
Mhm,
you know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
I've got a question about these citizens' assemblies. Do you just want to get the snapshot view of all these random people from hopefully disparate backgrounds? Or is there like an education process too? Maybe like you give people more information and then they change their views. Is that measured? At what point does it become like re-education and you're sort of programming people's minds differently through the process? I don't know.
My personal view is that there needs to be a lot more research on what kinds of opinion change is caused by deliberation, because right now there isn't really even that many repeatable protocols for deliberation. Like they're all organized by different people, they're done in different ways. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence. There's some empirical evidence. I mean, I think Jim Fishkin has written at least one paper about opinion change that resulted from a deliberative poll, which maybe you know more about there. But
I mean, I think of like the famous, I think it was a play first, the book 12 Angry Men, where,
ugh,
you
yes,
know,
I love that movie.
yeah, right? Like, 12 people go in, 11 people think a certain way, and by the end, they all have swung in the other direction.
Well, this raises a different issue about whether like one person can be way too persuasive.
Hmm.
But I mean, in that case, it was a good thing, but it may not always be. But I think there's like a lot of ideas also about not just the information changing people's opinions, but the idea of kind of developing like a collective identity. The idea that when you communicate with people who are different from you from all walks of life in your society, you develop this collectivist attitude when you start to care about the interests of your entire society because you kind of identify as a part of it. I do think there needs to be more research on that as well. I have attempted some, but it's pretty difficult to
Yeah,
measure.
it's interesting.
So
I have like just a couple of things on this. So one, the Meta community forums had embedded in them some extremely interesting data that you can view. It's publicly available. And what they did was basically survey the participants beforehand on a bunch of stuff, like their view on the particular issue being discussed, as well as their views on other things, as well as like their views on whether this thing was going to be crazy or whether it was going to work or not, whether they were worried about getting in arguments with people during it and so forth. And then they measured a bunch of that stuff again afterwards. And they have in their report these really interesting graphs and tables of how people's views changed before to after. I think some of the learnings that I took out of it, at least, were that people's opinions changed quite a bit. In the US part of it, it was pretty bipartisan. Like people on both sides were learning. When people showed up and were in this social situation, they were much less adversarial, much more open minded than I think I would have expected. And they came out saying they liked the process itself too. That's pretty compelling to me. You can go look at the data for yourself. I just want to raise there is a broader downside to this process, which I think is why it would never ever make sense to like use it for everything, which no one's advocating for, to be clear, but like, uh, which is that we think a huge part of running a government and making collective decisions for society is the accumulation of expertise and knowledge and experience over time. And that can be a bad thing. Certainly in America, you can conjure up these, I think, reasonable concerns that politicians become insulated, they become quote unquote career politicians and so forth. But it's also undeniably essential for getting stuff done, figuring out what needs to be done, who wants what. And these citizens' assemblies are a very bad tool for that because they meet once and then the people disappear. They don't gain that experience. You're sacrificing that in exchange for something else of value, which is this representativeness. And then two, like elected politicians, they want to win re-election. This is like the formal definition of accountability in political science is like they're now worried about winning re-election. And that's the engine that drives them to go figure out what needs to be done. The people participating in a citizens assembly do not have that incentive. They're already there. They've already gotten recruited or whatever. Other than their own sense of civic duty or the social norms of being in this room, which I think are quite effective, there is no long run, I want to do the best job I possibly can so I can win. And there may be lots of settings where that's actually quite problematic, where the fact that in some sense they have no skin in the game, it might be great when they just need to weigh in on an issue of value. But if it's a super difficult issue where you have to go way into the weeds and listen to briefings from a bunch of boring scientists and stuff, the fact that there's really nothing on the line for you is a huge concern.
The ideal situation in my mind is that you have this group of people and they have this wonderful property that they are not politically motivated.
Yeah,
And it also has a
yeah,
significant downside. But suppose you could just put a bunch of scientists in the room and some policymakers in the room, and the people can say, here, this is what we want. These are the values that we have. What the form of the output is, I think, is
yeah.
really important. And if you could
Hmm.
design the process so that their output could then directly say, okay, here's what we need to know from science in order to inform what we would recommend. And then you talk to the policymaker and they say, you know what? This is not going to get passed for these kind of complicated reasons. What do you think about this? It sounds like a messy process, but I think you can think of it in a pretty organized way of kind of querying experts and getting feedback. In computer science, it's kind of like online learning, if you want to think about it that way. I just think that there might be a way to get everything you want.
It's
Right.
interesting.
Should there be incentives for people to participate to help motivate people to make good decisions as well?
One of these like eye sortition
Yeah,
stickers.
something like that. Maybe they'd have to pick a different word so other people knew what it
No,
meant.
that'd be awesome.
I mean, I think you're getting at like a broader question of public trust in these processes, which maybe sounds unrelated, but I think something that I've also been thinking a lot about lately is what information needs to be provided to the public so that even if they disagree with the outcome, they still trust that the process was done in a way that represents their entire society. And they would be either compliant, if that's relevant, with the chosen policy, or maybe they'll support it in a referendum, even if it wouldn't have been their first choice, especially if it's put to referendum after the assembly, which sometimes happens. That's happened in Canada, it happened in Ireland. And when you think about what you need to release to the public, you have to start to ask yourself, what do you need to ask the participants of the process to report? And that's starting to get at like I sortitioned and kind of reflecting on maybe like what was your experience in the process? Did you listen to other people? Did other people listen to you? Was it truly deliberative, is how a political scientist would ask that question. And so I guess like injecting mechanisms of accountability and public transparency into the process might build in some of those incentives because what happened in the process will to some extent be public. Of
Yeah.
course, preserving anonymity when
Right. I was going to
necessary.
say, yeah, the
Yeah.
challenging trade-off, and Bailey and I were talking about this yesterday, is there's also downsides to identifying the participants. A definite concern is that if you were to empower this body on a highly controversial and high-stakes issue, then all kinds of powerful actors would have incentives to threaten, cajole, bribe the participants, and then having their identities public would be potentially bad. Yet at the same time, letting them be anonymous leads to doubts about whether the assembly was really even run at all. Was it run fairly? As well as then you lose this social value to the participant of getting to talk about it after. I mean, jury duty these are exactly the trade-offs
Yeah, this is like when you're trying
in
to
jury duty.
maybe charge a mob boss or something, and the people on the
Yeah.
jury are afraid for their safety or
Yes.
something.
Yes, and unfortunately, that recently there's been quite a few of these types of issues in the U.S., which has been pretty worrying. But I'd like to pause at this moment to put in a plug for the TV show Jury Duty. If you
Plug
haven't
it.
seen it,
Plug
it's
away. I have not
incredible.
seen it.
Oh my God, it's
Bailey, have you seen
strongly.
this?
No, I'm not.
Oh my God, the premise of this show, it's absolutely incredible.
Is it better
It's
than Judge Judy?
No.
well, that's a
I can
high
answer
bar.
that.
Yeah.
No.
The premise of the show is it's essentially a reality TV show. I'm not spoiling anything by telling you this, in which a real member of the American public was recruited for jury duty. And the only thing that he wasn't told was that the entire thing is fake and all
Oh
the
my
other
God.
people are actors.
This is just Truman
And
showed
they
him.
go
Oh,
through
That
they
is
go
brutal.
through a whole
This poor
trial.
guy.
They're very careful about the ethics of it. They did a fantastic job. And the trial just keeps getting
This is
increasingly
gonna
absurd.
This is going to destroy people's trust in sortition. If
It
you
is.
it could all be one giant catfishing scheme.
It's a concern. It's a concern. But you have to watch the show. It's amazing. It's amazing.
Speaking of TV, when we were all at dinner last night, I'm not sure if you noticed, but Benedict Cumberbatch was at the table next to us.
are you kidding me?
So have you confirmed that as
Definitely him. Yeah, 100%.
how did you
What?
confirm?
I looked at him again with my eyes.
Fair enough. I trust you.
Deduction.
It's
The power of deduction, Watson.
very exciting.
I'm
very
so
exciting.
mad that did not make it to my end of the table. Unreal.
Yeah. Anyway, you never know. You might serve on a jury with Benedict.
That's how you know you're getting punked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to take things back to the tech sector. With these new technologies that are coming online between AI and Web3, how might a governance system like this apply? What experiments are being run with sortition with respect to these?
There are a bunch of experiments, as I mentioned, and I like to point out that it was the first one. Meta ran a community forum on having to do with AI guardrails, and it was very much a pilot. So, like, the company received public input from the process, but the assembled people did not have binding authority to make any decisions. So it's in that sense very much a pilot, though that's true of most citizens assemblies in the real world too. And I'm very pleased to observe that other AI companies have learned from that. And so both OpenAI and Anthropic have used, whether it's sortition or not is not exactly clear, clearly inspired by Meta's community forum on AI. And the way they work is different from one another. So in OpenAI's case, they framed it as sort of getting democratic inputs, again, for guardrails. And it was a little bit, I would say, closer to the community forum in the sense that it was about recruiting a representative group of, I think it was just Americans. And that is pretty interesting because it was across a number of countries, which required solving thorny linguistical issues and stuff, which was pretty cool. And so the OpenAI one was similar in that sense, but it was a little bit closer to like, there's like a fine line that you can't really actually tell the difference of sometimes between like sortition, which sounds fancy, and like a focus group, which sounds less fancy.
Yeah.
The Anthropic one looks quite different in the sense that it was sort of like integrated into their technology in a kind of fascinating way, where essentially this group of representative people, again, I think theirs was only Americans, was asked to help brainstorm a list of principles, a very long list, like 50 principles. So one would be like, make sure when you answer questions, keep in mind that some people might have different abilities and that you shouldn't answer assuming that a person, can walk everywhere or something like that. It's a list of like 50 of those. And then those are actually fed into the system prompt. Essentially, they're just like copy pasted into the like system prompt for Claude. And like the Meta one, it's a very early pilot. It's not actually that amazing to like end up adding a few sentences to a system prompt in the same way that it's not that amazing to have a focus group make some recommendations and then the company can do whatever they want. But like these are early experiments and it's cool to see them. They're sharing some properties in terms of randomly recruiting representative people, and then they're taking the outputs and inputting them into the systems in different ways.
I think something to add here is one huge challenge that we just have not solved is that deliberation takes place in plain text.
Mm.
And then the output is currently plain text. But in the end, even if the algorithm takes in plain text like Claude, when we go to actually measure if that intervention worked, what you're going to get is a bunch of metrics. You have to distill things into numbers and functions and statistics. And as soon as you have to do that, you start to have to make trade offs that were not even considered by the people in the process. And so the question is, how do you get the process to produce an output that is so close to the algorithm that, like, there's just not much gap that has to be filled in by technical people? Because any gap between where the assembly leaves off and the actual metrics that are going to be used to evaluate the system will have to be filled in undemocratically. I think this is a huge challenge when we have people weighing in on technical systems.
Yeah, this is a huge and is an ongoing area of interesting evolution with the oversight board. So the oversight board is not a sortition mechanism, but it shares a lot of these features, that it's a group of people. They actually have binding power over Meta, which I think makes them especially interesting relative to these pilots. So they have the legal authority to overrule a company on pieces of content. And so they might order a piece of content to be removed, and Meta is legally obligated to do that. But then there's these insanely complicated technical issues about like, well, what about this other thousands of pieces of content that are a lot like this one, but a little bit different? It's the same video, but it's been tweaked. It's a similar image, but it's a little bit different. And it's been a big area of push and pull with the board, is sort of like, do we have access to the technical know-how and data that we need to be able to judge whether the company has complied with our order or not? I think we're learning a lot from that give and take that will teach us for AI and for these citizens' assemblies how you might go about doing that. So one idea that's come out of that is like the oversight board should have access to its own team of engineers and data scientists who can actually check. And the thing is, they'll work for the oversight board, not for the company. And so those people will not have economic incentives to like say whatever the company wants them to say, is the claim. So you could imagine replicating some of those features for a citizens assembly in AI.
Or on any topic. I mean, having those experts in the room to
Yeah.
kind of go back and forth and say, okay, this is how I'm translating your words into the technical inputs. Here's the output that happens when you do that. Are you satisfied with this, or what's wrong with it? And kind of iterate in that process. I think that would be useful for many, many different topics, not just AI.
Definitely. The devil is always in the details. I mean, even if you look at our political process, everybody generally wants the same thing, right? Like
Yeah.
prosperity, fairness, liberty. But Republicans and Democrats have a different way of going about
Yeah.
that. It's all in the implementation details.
There's a huge debate that I don't think anyone has brought in. I don't know how you would study it. It needs to be studied. But there is a very deep question in online governance, which applies to AI, to social media, to everything else, Airbnb, Spotify, PayPal, any platform that's governing itself, which is, if you're making decisions that are too consequential to society for you as a company to even want to make yourself, because it's actually in your interest to get out of the trap of having to make these really difficult decisions. Is it more important, with the goal of getting society to trust that this process is fair, is it more important to give out the power to set the policies, which is pretty much how most citizens' assemblies are headed? Or is it actually more important to give out the power to enforce, to decide whether the policy has been enforced correctly or not. And if you talk to
Hmm.
different people in tech who work in the people deep in the weeds, you will find people with super strong views on both sides. So just to take Meta as an example, it's writing Meta's community standards and content policies. That's where the power lies. That's where you decide what counts as what. And then other people equally deep in the weeds will be like, no, it's all about deciding how you're going to enforce it at scale. The rules are not the key thing. It's the enforcement at scale. And it's a huge, deep question. Which of those is more important to give out? And I actually don't think I haven't seen any academic work really show us the path forward and like how would you even go about figuring out which of those is more important. And it may be different for every platform and every problem.
Hmm. My sense personally is that you maybe want to give both. Because part of specifying the rules that you think should be followed is actually making sure that they're followed in a way that reflects your values, that you are trying to communicate, usually in text. I mean, what is the point of specifying what you want if you don't then get to hold the company accountable for enforcing it?
I think the challenge is that people will say writing these policies
Mm,
requires insanely deep knowledge and expertise. And you think they're easy to write and they're unbelievably hard to write, which is clearly true.
totally.
Same way, like if you don't understand these ML systems, you can't possibly develop enforcement at scale in a way that's going to make any sense. And so it's those information asymmetries are, I think, what dogs the discussion of what to give out.
Yeah, I think my optimistic view is that we just need to find new ways to work together, which is super hard, right? I mean, talking to someone as a really technical person who is in the weeds, trying to communicate with someone who's non technical. I mean, this happens in all spheres, like working with practitioners as a computer scientist. You're bringing such different things to the table. And part of that is learning to value the contributions of the other group really seriously, even if they're different from your own and they don't speak your language. And, maybe sometimes it's harder. You have to do like more work and more math, but it's just so fruitful. And I think it's just an investment to learn to communicate across. And maybe we haven't really figured out how to do that yet because the incentives haven't existed. But I don't think it's impossible.
No, I don't think it's impossible either. It's just hard to figure out where to start. If you're running like $1 trillion online platform, it's a little bit risky to like give these things out if there's some risk that it's going to go catastrophically wrong because people don't understand how the systems work. That's the problem.
But maybe it's possible to nail the process in a low stakes
Yeah.
test case, right? I
Yes.
mean,
Agreed.
because the process is not entirely separate, but somewhat separate from the stakes of the decision.
Yeah, I totally
So,
agree.
Is this an opportunity to run experiments in Web3? I mean, surely there are lots of platforms that are securing lots and lots of value, but there are also, a million experiments blossoming that are doing all sorts of crazy things and just
For
seeing
sure.
what works.
I think that's totally right. No, I think we're already learning a ton from those. I think there's a whole deep conversation we should have with Bailey on how you would implement sortition for Web3, because it seems very, very interesting and not obvious how you would like the Sybil problem, which means that you can't sample people all that easily. Obviously, one area which people are already working on is like creating notions of identity that get you around the Sybil problem, at which point we could just apply normal sortition tools, perhaps. The other question is like, could you design Sybil resistant sortition in a way that would be useful?
I would be really interested in trying to understand, are there mechanisms that allow you to at least learn something about who is who, even if you don't have a perfect understanding of, this wallet corresponds to this person or something. Maybe you would have a little bit more information. And what are the trade-offs between getting that information and what you can do with it later? Because I think there's a lot of benefits to representation and power distribution if you know things about people. But in order to elicit that information in an incentive compatible way, you may need to actually distort power in ways that you don't want to.
Say more. What do you mean by distort power?
If you want to incentivize people to reveal information about themselves, people in this system are represented just by coins or wallets or these things that are not really tied to an entity. And there's this problem where you don't want people to be incentivized to spread out all of their assets across many different wallets and pretend to be many people because then it makes them entitled to more power. And you
Yeah.
also don't want to incentivize other kinds of dynamics like that. And so one way of maybe doing this would be to actually incentivize people to consolidate their assets into one place,
Huh.
which would
Mhm.
require maybe creating like really steep rewards for having more assets, like steeper than what I'll call linear.
Mm.
And so that is like really distorting power toward people who have a lot of assets. But
Right,
it
which
also,
doesn't sound like it would go over
it's
quite well.
probably kind of bad. I personally am pretty allergic to that idea.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you can learn something about who people are because they've consolidated their assets, at least to some degree. So now you can see entities a little bit better. And so you gain information. And with that information, can you now, in an incentive compatible way, rebalance power and maybe even do better than you could have done with no information at all?
I like that. It's sort of a precursor. Before we would think about sortition, let's think about whether we can create the conditions for incentivizing the development of these kind of like stable identities via these incentives to collect your stuff under one address. Yeah.
Right. You can think about it in this strange way of almost, well, at like an auction or something. If you want to create an auction for the opportunity to participate, if you structure the auction in a way that puts people in the position that they want to consolidate their assets, you can then learn about who is in the auction. And the nice thing about sortition and then the subsequent process of decision making in Web3 is that in Web3, it's totally viable to reweight votes. It's already being done. I mean, the default is you have the power commensurate to the amount of wealth that you have because of the Sybil problem. And so you now have two levers to tune, right? You can tune the probability or the opportunity to participate. And once people are in the room, you can tune the voting power that people have. So you have two levers now, the chance to participate and the weight that your vote will count with. And both of those are just ways to toggle power. And maybe there's some way to use both of those in order to do something better than just randomly sampling uniformly the coins or the wallets, which will just allocate power proportionally to the money that you have. So it's unclear to me
Yeah,
whether it will work, but
that's really
This also
interesting.
sounds like it could potentially be a perfect sort of area where ZK, zero knowledge cryptography, could come into play, where you could prove that you were the owner of a number of addresses, but without revealing that necessarily to the broader public.
That.
And so you could maybe prove to the system that you are who you say you are, you own these addresses, but you don't have to reveal yourself,
that would
your
be even
identity.
better if it were possible to just get information like that, not for free, but with like very clever cryptography and algorithms. I mean, the more information you can get for free, the better. But if you can't get any, how do you incentivize its revelation? I mean, maybe we have to do another podcast.
Yeah, we have a lot more to discuss.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you both for joining.
Thank you.
Yeah,
for
thank
having
you.
us.
All right.